Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's always a pleasure to rise on behalf of my constituents from Kelowna Lake Country. I'm here today to speak on Bill C-34. Since Confederation, people from all over the world have believed in Canada as a place worth investing in. But an open-door policy for investment will only improve the public good if we keep our eyes wide open to whom comes through our door. In this, the Liberals have proven far too lax and have been asleep for 8 years. It is a different time than it was generations ago, and different than even 8 years ago. A business that leaves its door open and unattended to will swiftly go broke. So too will a country that does not recognize the difference between an investing free market ally and untrustworthy regimes. So I'm glad, in the name of improving our economic and national security, that this legislation has been put forward in this bill before us today to strengthen the Investment Canada Act. But I cannot hide my disappointment that they've dragged their feet for 8 years to do so and still provide legislation that, if I were being honest, is really only half finished. What we have before us is a bill that asks Parliament to protect the security of foreign investment by granting more power to the very ministers who ignored foreign investment threats. Traditionally, Mr. Speaker, when the security guard falls asleep, he doesn't get a promotion the next day. The laundry list of these instances runs quite long in the 8 years of the Liberals in power, so I will only provide a few examples of the government's negligence in the name of time today. In 2017, the then Minister of Industry failed to request a full national security review of the acquisition of BC-based telecommunications company Norsat International and its subsidiary Sinclair Technologies by the China-based Hytera Communications. In 2019, that minister failed again to request a full national security review when the Chinese SOEs Resources purchased the Manitoba-based Tantalum Mining Corporation, one of Canada's largest lithium producers. In 2020, the Minister of Foreign Affairs approved another China-based company in Nuktek to supply security equipment to 170 Canadian embassies and consulates. In 2022, that same Foreign Affairs Minister then became the Minister of Industry and approved the takeover of Canada's Neo-Lithium Corporation by a Chinese state-owned enterprise with no national security review. To talk about this one for a moment, this undermined Canada's supply chain opportunities. So lithium is classified as a critical mineral in Canada, which Ottawa says are critical to Canada's economy and imperative to battery storage, in particular for the electric vehicle industry. The regime of China is establishing global dominance on securing critical mineral assets and intellectual property, which are imperative to high-tech manufacturing, including electric vehicles. This is a prime example of when you give the subjective authority to one person, a minister, as opposed to having solid laws and policies. Just last month, it was discovered that the Minister of Public Safety allowed the RCMP and Canadian Border Services Agency to sign equipment deals with Hytera Communications, despite the United States having banned them from doing business after charging them with 21 counts of espionage. Communications technologies, security equipment, lithium mining are integral parts of Canadians' national security and the security of our allies. Lithium mining and the export of other critical minerals are vital to breaking Western reliance on Chinese-made electronics. We are blessed in Canada with some of the continent's widest amount of mineable minerals. Still, as I've outlined today, the Liberal government has been more receptive in providing access to our natural resources to our foes than our friends. State-owned enterprises are not operating separately from the interests of their centralized autocratic governments. Sadly, it's taken until year 8 of this government to realize that. So it's also taken them 8 years to develop a critical mineral strategy, leaving us behind in supplying ourselves and our allies. Though I will mention that the Liberal strategy on critical minerals really isn't a comprehensive strategy. The International Energy Agency forecasts that by 2030, the production of electric vehicles could reach 43 million units per year, with production valued at more than $567 billion US. Robin Goad, President and Chief Executive Officer of Fortune Minerals Limited, said his company has been speaking with the federal government about critical minerals for more than 5 years, but has yet to see substantive action. Their proposed mine would supply Canada with minerals like cobalt, gold, copper, and provide much-needed employment to the Canadians in the Northwest Territories. Mr. Goodwood put it best when he said of this government on critical minerals, "It's all smoke and mirrors right now," unquote. Quote, "It's time to stop talking about this and actually start doing something." Mined in Canada, cobalt, graphite, lithium, and nickel could become made-in-Canada batteries, supplying our allies' electric needs while improving our environment. Instead, the Liberals chose to drag their feet on clean, green prosperity for Canadians. Well, Mr. Speaker, a Conservative government will do something. We'll recognize that our natural resources are Canadians' opportunities for prosperity, not bureaucracy. I previously sat on the Industry Committee, and some of this work has been done on previous studies, including the critical minerals study and the study on the acquisition of neolithium. The witness testimony on neolithium for that study brought out how the discretionary nature of the current legislation has left Canada vulnerable. The informal decision-making process has had little transparency and accountability. As well, testimony stated how having a government department lead a national security review process instead of those who are security experts was concerning on how this could protect Canada's assets. Similarly, Conservatives at the Industry Committee are prepared to do the hard work in amending this legislation to enforce the precautions the Liberal ministers consistently forgot to take. So, Mr. Speaker, to summarize on these changes to the Investment Canada Act, it is a very difficult world right now with unstable regimes in the world. The Liberals have been asleep for 8 years, and this has left us vulnerable. This has been partially studied already at the Industry Committee, which I was formerly a member. Under this Prime Minister, Canada has failed to conduct full security reviews on acquisitions within Canada by Chinese regime state-owned enterprises. This is at the same time when the Prime Minister can't find a business case for LNG while Germany and Japan are begging for it. Conservatives will work hard to create jobs, bolster our allies, and protect Canada's intellectual and resource assets. Conservatives want to ensure this long-overdue updating of the Investment Canada Act legislation features an automatic review system, as well as net benefit analysis of any investment by a state-owned enterprise. This is just plain common sense. We would not wish to allow the entry of foreign state competitors into critical areas of Canada's security and economy. Similarly, Conservatives will seek to allow the government to list and completely prohibit state-owned enterprises from countries with which Canada should not be doing business at this time. I'm sure no constituent of mine would wish to see a Putin-backed enterprise buying into a Canadian company. Let's ensure this bill can draw that red line. We can't have the uncertainty that would be created by selling off our critical mineral assets when we need these minerals for our modern world, including for electric batteries. Mr. Speaker, after 8 years of blindfolds from this government on foreign acquisition of Canadian companies, intellectual properties, intangible assets, and the data of Canadians, Conservatives at the Industry Committee will do what we can to ensure this bill fully protects our economic and national security interests from nations who do not wish us well. We need to encourage investment while at the same time protecting Canadian interests. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire of the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, the necessity for this legislation, given the changes that have been happening, I think is extremely important. And I know that the member in her speech talked about the fact that things are different than they were 20 years ago, or even just a few years ago. The reality is that as we look to attract new investment and we continue to open our company to investment from throughout the world, we need to have a secure legislation in place to ensure that the integrity of our economic system, the integrity of our political systems is kept in place. I'm wondering if the member can comment on how you properly balance that between bringing that investment into our country, investment like the investment in my neighboring riding of Hastings, Lennox and Addington, represented by a Conservative member, of the largest battery manufacturing plant in North America. How do we ensure that we can have that proper balance in our country while also bringing in the economic activity?
Member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. Absolutely, and this is part of why this legislation is very important, and also that we need to add in a few other things that Conservatives will be asking for when and if this moves forward, in order so that we can protect Canadian interests. And it really goes down to looking at the regimes, where you have the state-owned enterprises. There were a number of recommendations that were made at the Industry Committee. Not all of those recommendations went into this Act, and so that's one of the things that we'll be looking at. There was a lot of testimony that went into that, and so Conservatives will be bringing forth other recommendations to actually make this even stronger. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire, l'honorable député de Joliette.
The honourable member for Joliette. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for her speech. I think we agree on the fact that we need to improve this bill. There is an interpretation that I find too narrow, and the amendments that we might bring to the bill might be also too limited. So we in the Bloc Québécois think we should create a new bill in order to better control foreign investment in general, especially when it comes to preserving our business headquarters and our resources. What does my colleague think?
L'honorable député de Kelowna Lake Country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question from my colleague. There are some parts of this bill that are very vague, and just as an example, the legislation does not make changes to the Act's definition of a state-owned enterprise. And that could be considered in itself, just that one piece, as very vague. I think we need to look at what recommendations for amendments are being brought forth by all parties, and that work will, if this bill moves forward, would happen at the committee stage, where really all members can dig in the weeds, look at what recommendations everyone is bringing forth, and assess them, and then go from there. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire, the honourable member for South Shore St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I enjoyed the member for Kelowna Lake Country's speech very much, and I appreciate the work that the member did on the Industry Committee study on this issue in terms of this Act in the last Parliament, which made 9 recommendations, but this bill only addresses 2 of those 9 recommendations. And recommendation 1, which I think would address a lot of the concerns of members from that report, was that the threshold for investments made by state-owned enterprises in Canada for the review on national security or net benefit be reduced from $415 million to 0. And I'd like to know whether the member has any views on that aspect.
The honourable member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. That is something absolutely worth considering and should really be considered in this. We know that, as I said in my speech, it is a very different time than it was 10, 15 years ago, and so we need to be amending our laws and our legislation to more reflect what the current environment is, what the current economic environment, safety precautions, what the current situation is in the world, and that in itself, based on the current environment that we're seeing with some of these estate regimes, some of these regimes that are in the world, who have made very public what some of their plans are. We need to take that into consideration when we're developing legislation. Thank you.